We will read that here in just a moment, but we will stop or pause perhaps, it's the mot juste, and have a word of prayer before we begin. So if you'd pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this world that you have made. We thank you for providing us your word. We are grateful for the opportunities that we have to read from it, to study it. We ask that you would bless us now at this time as we do those things to help us to better understand it, help us to better understand you, understand your will for our lives and for the world, and so that we may serve you better with the words and the deeds that we have. We are grateful, Father, for all that you have done, all that you will do, and we are most grateful that you sent your Son, Jesus, thankful for his sacrifice on our behalf. We pray these things in Jesus' name. All right. Psalm 53. For the chief musician, set to Mahalath, a maskil of David. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and have done abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. God looked down from the heavens upon the children of men to see if there were any who understood, who sought after God. Every one of them has gone back. They have together become filthy. There is none who does good. No, not one. Have they no knowledge, the workers of iniquity, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God? There they feared a fear where no fear was, for God scattered the bones of him who encamps against you. You have put them to shame because God has rejected them. Oh, that from Zion had come the salvation of Israel, when God restores the fortunes of his people. May Jacob rejoice, may Israel be glad. So this is a short psalm, only 6 verses. But what is this psalm about?
It's kind of a shake-up.
A shake-up?
When you're trying to get something through to somebody,
Okay.
and they're not paying attention,
Okay.
and you grab their shoulders and you shake them and you say it again.
Right. You got them by the lapel and you're...
Yeah, real close to the face.
Okay.
That's what he's trying to get across to you. You got all this stuff going on. It almost sounds like they were putting up with it, but they understood that, the iniquities and all the garbage that was going on. He was saying, it would be way better if God brought salvation to everybody. Anyway,
It's certainly a very forceful psalm. Yeah, I mean, he starts out quite strong, and he kind of continues that way throughout. Yeah. It is speaking to the foolish people, the fools of this world. Now, of course, a fool within the biblical context is a little bit different than what we would normally think of when we use the word fool in English or in a Western context. We think of it as being someone who has no knowledge or wisdom, does dumb things. But there's an additional element in the Hebrew concept of fool. Do you remember what that is? What additional layer does that take on as a necessity of the meaning?
Moral deficiencies.
Moral deficiencies. It does not simply refer to someone who is a dum-dum, right? Someone who's not so bright. It's not about that. You could be, and indeed, right, you are not so bright, not doing what's right, but you are also deficient in a moral sense. This is culpable ignorance, something for which you are responsible. You should know better. You should do better. You should have been taught how to do this, right? The idea of moral problem and moral deficiency goes along with this ignorance and this conception of foolishness. Yeah?
Yeah, I think it goes along. I think this is a pretty good parallel for today's world right now. It doesn't mean they're uneducated, and it doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means you can be very educated and still be stupid.
Sure, right. Making poor choices. Yeah. That you are making bad decisions, again, in a moral sense.
Intentionally.
Yes, you're choosing. Again, not that you were forced into it, but you have chosen badly. All right. Does any of this sound familiar to anybody? The psalm that we just read?
Well, you see it in Proverbs quite often, this kind of thing.
This is true. There's a lot in Proverbs talking about the things that a fool does or does not do, the problems that they have, warnings to not be like them. Yes, it is shot throughout Proverbs from front to back, a lot about the fool. But specifically to this particular psalm and what it says. Anyone? This is almost a word-for-word repetition of Psalm 14. If you want to flip back and take a look, I'll let you, that's fine, I can wait a minute. But it is nearly, there's a few changes. Some of them we'll talk about here, the somewhat significant changes. But it is mostly Psalm 14. Now there's a substitution of the holy name. They don't use Yahweh in this one, in Psalm 53. They use, I believe it's Elohim. They use a different word for God. And there is a change in the number of verses. The verse numbering is a little different. Even though it's almost exactly the same number of words, even in English, it's almost the exact same number of words. Psalm 14 actually is broken into 7 verses and this one into 6. And I'm not sure why. And there's a big change in one of the verses that is coming up in verse 5. Well, again, it depends on how you're counting between the two Psalms, which verse it is that we're talking about, 5 or 6. But there's a significant change to one of the later verses. But the first part of it is the same. Most people that talk about this and study this, and who have much more Hebrew knowledge than I do, would agree that this is actually a later iteration of the first one. That 14 was written first, and then 53, and that this one was written modified. Someone deliberately took something that was known, something that was familiar, something that was already existing, and recast it. There's a difference in the superscriptions as well. This one has an additional note, apparently about the music or the way it was to be performed or done. And so it may be that it was set to a different set of music or a different tune. They altered some of that. And the word changes seem to indicate that it was modified to fit a different and subsequent occasion as well. So the appearance is that this one was written secondarily. Of course, in a more meta kind of way, if we can stand to use that term here, this is in Book 2 of the Psalms, and Psalm 14 is, of course, in Book 1 of the Psalms. And this is just a kind of a little piece of evidence that gives a little bit of weight, a little more weight to the idea that these books may have originally been collected separately before being collected together. In other words, that different people at different times have put together collections of psalms for different purposes, and the book of Psalms, as we have it, is really just kind of, again, a more grand collection of different things. So, Wayne, were you going to get your hand? I don't know if you're trying to get my attention. No? Yes?
No, I'm just good.
Okay. I do that too. Sometimes I'll reach up, and then people think I'm raising my hand. All right. So we talked a little bit about why the same psalm will be included twice. What is actually different? We talked about that in terms of the use of the holy name, or the lack thereof. But the other part of this is, if we look at, I'm going to flip back here, and this is the NIV, because I have much more convenient numbering in here to help me find things. If we look at verse 5 in Psalm 53, and verses 5 and 6 in Psalm 14, verses 5 and 6 in Psalm 14 are, "There they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge." And then in Psalm 53, "There they were, overwhelmed with dread, where there was nothing to dread. God scattered the bones of those who attacked you. You put them to shame, for God despised them." It is this section right here that has the largest and probably most significant change between the two psalms. And this appears to be the crux of why someone would repeat this psalm in large part, and then why it would be included a second time also, is because it is now, in some sense, functionally a different psalm. Even if we leave aside what we don't know for sure, that it may have been written to a different set of music as well, to go with similar words. So, this is the big and probably key difference between these. But first, at the beginning, the fools are condemned. We should pity these fools. The fools are condemned. Why?
He denies God, says there is no God.
Because they say there is no God. They deny the reality of God. And this is an important consideration for the understanding of the manifest nature of God, that God should be obvious even to those who have the meanest intelligence. The reality of the divine, that the obviousness that the world as it is must therefore entail a divine being who created it, is obvious. And to deny this is not just foolish in the sense that we would use it as being silly and not very smart or lacking in this wisdom, but also morally culpable, that we are going to be condemned should we deny the existence of God, that it is a moral deficiency to do so. This is the ultimate expression of foolishness. Everything follows on from this. That there's a first foundation, right? We have to acknowledge that God exists. This is the first step to any sort of knowledge of God, to any sort of obedience to God, to receiving any sort of salvation from God. None of that is possible without that first, most basic baseline admission of God's reality. And then from there, other things can then follow. In some ways, I might argue that this is one of the worst sorts of things that you can do, to deny that God exists. Because it is the first, or maybe that's the wrong way to put it, it prevents you from going on to any of the other truths that we should know in a moral way. Without God, none of them are possible. Without God, none of those other moral truths can exist. And therefore, to deny God is to deny all of them. I mentioned that earlier. Why did I put that in order? All right. When God searches for the righteous, he finds none. Is this a literal understanding of what is going on? For example, we think of the story of Abraham and speaking to God about Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, and there's this sort of, not to get into the whole idea of changing God's mind and things like that, but the quasi-bargaining sort of situation where Abraham says, if you find a certain number of people who are righteous, will you spare the city? And he keeps trying to lower that number, right? Is this a more literal idea of like, I'm going to see if I can find any one person who is righteous and I cannot find one? Is this a more figurative understanding? How should we understand what he's saying? Wait, yeah.
Well, as you already said, he's addressing the foolish.
Mm-hmm.
So among that audience that he's addressing, or that he's focused on, there is no righteous.
Okay. Certainly among the foolish there is no one who is righteous. It's precluded by their foolishness in denying the existence of God. Certainly. But what about the wider world? Does God find anyone righteous within the wider world?
I hope so.
Well, we hope so. Okay. I mean, we would desire and hope to be among them, certainly, but does anyone remember where this gets cited in the New Testament? This is in Romans. Did I put this in my next note? I did not. All right. Well, but Bree gives us the answer, right? That all of mankind is sinful and debased, and this is talked about in Romans chapter 3. I should flip over there quickly. If I've been smarter than I am, I would have put a bookmark there. That's fairly quick. There we are.
Is it on verse 5?
Verse 10.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. There is a section here where he quotes from several of the Psalms, but he says here, as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. He goes on to quote from a few other Psalms in this section here. But when he is quoting this to the Romans in his letter, he is asking them about the differences between the Jew and the Gentile, the benefits of the law versus not having the law, or the relative detriments of these things. And he's pointing out that even among the Jews who had the law, none of them were to be considered righteous. He is citing this psalm in defense of the idea that everyone in the world is sinful and requires salvation. That the righteous do not exist in and of themselves. That we are not righteous through our own efforts. That nothing that we do achieves righteousness for us, and thus we are all in need of the salvation of God. That the law does not bring us righteousness. It brings us cognizance of sin, cognizance of guilt. Whether or not this original psalm was written in support of that idea, Paul certainly takes it to be useful in explicating this idea that in fact you and I and everyone else is not righteous. Not on our own. We become righteous through the blood of Christ. His righteousness is imputed to us. But again, that's maybe not originally where the psalmist was coming from. But it is certainly an important thing to be gleaned from this, is that this is an inspired thing to say, and it is quoted that way. No one is righteous. Everyone at some point turns away from God and sins. And the one sin, whatever it is, any sin, is filthy. It is anathema to a holy and righteous God.
It separates us from God.
It separates us from Him entirely, because He is indeed holy and set apart. He is sacred and pure, and He cannot abide any unrighteousness. So therefore, our unrighteousness does separate us from Him. Yeah, very much so. Here I'm running ahead of my notes. All right. I don't want to rush past this too fast. This is certainly interesting because of the way that it gets cited in Romans, but I did want to try and hopefully get to the difference between 14 and 53 before I run out of time. So before I move on to 4, anything further to say about this concept of righteousness and unrighteousness? I want to hustle past that too fast, since it is such a fundamental thing. All right. The question in verse 4 appears to be rhetorical. If that's the case, then if he's asking a rhetorical question to which we should know the answer, and in doing so making a point, what is he trying to say here? Will the evildoers never learn, those who devour my people as men eat bread and who do not call on God?
Well, that's where the shake part comes.
Okay.
Don't you understand?
Okay.
You know, what you're doing and the no belief in God and what you're doing, there must apparently have been talk around that world about who the Israelites were.
Sure, sure.
Or what they professed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's saying is, you come in and you devour my people and you do this and that. Don't you get it? So that's the shaking your shoulders part.
Okay.
That it's kind of like I can't believe you could be that stupid.
Yeah, it does seem to indicate the kind of, a way of, again, making that point. You should realize this, don't you know? Right? We say that when we want to drive home that point, again, with that rhetorical question.
Based on whatever evidence there already had been about who the people were, maybe they had won some battles or that some force that would have caused somebody who was paying attention to understand. Because if there was no understanding, there wouldn't have been any of this talk about them being foolish or whatever. So there had to have been some proof in the past who he was.
Yeah. One of the key thing that we're going to get into this in just a minute when we get on to the next verse, but one of the key differences between these two versions of this idea is that it appears to be equally applicable as an internally focused question in Psalm 14. That you can be thinking about this as people within Israel itself who simply do what is wrong, right? Those that are sinful and those that reject God, those that do iniquitous things, that do bad things as a regular kind of practice. And they prey upon the people around them. And 53, because of the next verse and the way that that is cast, appears to shift that to an external force, which would have, the first one could have easily applied to, other nations preying upon Israel. But 53 makes that much more explicit or more of the maybe primary reading of it, that they have changed what it focuses on slightly. But in both cases, it is talking about someone who is taking advantage of others, someone who is doing this and then not realizing or not willing to believe in the consequences of their actions. That God does not sleep, right? It's not that he doesn't know. It's not that God doesn't care. It's that the judgment will come and salvation for the people of Israel, and by extension, right, as Paul's usage of it for Christianity and those that believe in God, all of us, eventually, and that those that do evil deny this or close their eyes to this fact and are trying to hide from what they should know to be true, right? Do they not know, the workers of iniquity who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God? Do they not know what? All of these things that have come before, that God is there and that people are not righteous, and he sees, God searches out the hearts of men, and he knows what people are doing. They should know and recognize this. So they are acting out of ignorance, but also the deliberate malice. The true fool, right? The biblical fool. If they're in ignorance about this, it doesn't matter. They're still acting maliciously to harm and to hurt. All right. I already kind of spoiled that question there. The alteration of 5 change the meaning of the psalm. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Psalm 14 indicates that the wicked should fear because they would pray on the poor. The verb here used is a would. A thing that they will do, have done, will continue doing. This is their intention, this is their design. So, I should have, again, put a bookmark in there so I can flip back and forth more easily. In 14, in verse 6, the evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Excuse me, refuge. Saying that this is the thing that they are doing and continue to do. But if we look in the one in 53, the wicked fear because they have been, it is a past tense. They have been surprised by God. You have put them to shame because God has rejected them. God scattered the bones of him who encamps against you. God has pronounced and executed judgment already on some of those that have attacked his people. And the use of this phrase, who encamps against you, speaks of a siege. It's a siege word, speaking of those that have attacked, surrounded, and tried to destroy, apparently, the city of Jerusalem. There are a number of people that argue that this has to do then, or this was modified on the occasion of an enemy attack that God has then frustrated. Such as when, I believe it was the Assyrians come and encamp around Jerusalem. They have a minute army, and no one knows how they're going to get out of this until they wake up one morning and go out and they're dead. God has struck them down in the night. And no one realizes this until it's all over. Right? And this goes along with the first part of that verse. They feared a fear where no fear was. That the idea that they had no fear, they had no sense, no inkling of the doom that was to come upon them until it arrived. They were given fear in the midst of what they thought was security. Wayne.
And I think it's interesting that he not only took them out, but he totally dismembered what was left.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was spread like fertilizer across the plain. There was nothing left.
Yeah. words used to describe the nature of the destruction of those that would oppose God and his people. He scatters their bones. Scattered the bones of him who encamps against you. Why is that particularly significant in a psalm? Is anybody familiar with the Jewish customs around death?
That they had to be taken care of and buried within 24 hours.
They had to be taken care of and buried. They also have a very significant need or desire or prescription that the whole body must be buried. That you keep the corpse together and bury it all together. That it is a desecration and a violation to be committed against the dead to keep it separate or to prevent someone from being buried. And the idea then that God would scatter the bones of their enemies so that they are lost, they can never be gathered together again, never be given a proper burial, is the ultimate sort of insult added to injury. That not only are they defeated, not only are they destroyed, but the very bodies of them, the very bones are scattered to the four winds so that they can never be brought back together and treated to a proper burial. They have been utterly, utterly destroyed. A destruction from which there is no sort of recovery. And in a Jewish context, this was so important. There's a story in one of the later Kings or Chronicles. I just thought of this, which is why I don't have a citation. Someone is executed by the king, and they are condemned upon their execution to be hung from a tree. Their body is just left exposed. And the story goes that the person's mother stays there by the body and lives there in order to drive away any sort of scavenging animals, to prevent the body from being scattered. Because it has been forbidden to have it taken out and buried. And so in order to keep the person intact, she gives up everything else and going to have to stay there. And this is the seriousness with which they took this particular kind of imposition, or this particular custom. It was very, very, very important. And so again, to say that this would be done is far more significant for someone in their context than it is necessarily for us reading it at this point, because we don't have the same sort of cultural prescriptions, right? We are okay with things like cremation. We don't get upset when people scatter ashes at sea and so forth. But to the Jewish mind of this time, it would have been abominable to consider that. Yeah.
Well, it used to be that before the embalming process, that people would, when there was somebody that died, they'd put them on the picnic table outside, and somebody would sit over the body so the wild animals wouldn't come and dismember them or take
Sure.
parts of their body. So it was a ritual that isn't that far back in our history.
There are other sorts of customs regarding waking and so forth like that for people that have died. But yeah, it was very, very seriously taken in Jewish culture. All right. The wicked are fearing here in 53 again because they have been versus they were. And this is what is changing the context of the psalm from 14 to 53. That's what I just said. So 53 is taking God's past action as a reference. If we think about 14 and the way that 14 concludes, which is the same verse, essentially, as we have in 53. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. And 53, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When God restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. It is the same verse, but it is given a different sort of context or contextual meaning given to what comes immediately before it. 14 is, again, continually thinking about things in sort of present or future sense. The idea that this is the sort of thing that the wicked do, the wicked prey on the good people, and God defends them, and they are constantly in need of God's protection and defense. But this is actually taking a past event where God has acted, and then in verse 6, the final verse, actually 7, 6 or 7, depending on which one you're looking at, looking ahead to a future salvation. And why then would you look forward to a future salvation after having spoken of one that has already been accomplished? What is there to look forward to if the thing about which you are concerned, the enemy encamping against you, has already been dealt with? God has defeated them and scattered their bones. Yeah.
Well, I think in general, there's an application for us today, the way this is referring to, thousands of years ago when these things were happening to God's people then. Fast forwarding to Rome and Christians and how the Romans then probably laughed and, they had a sporting event to watch Christians be beaten and all these horrible things. They probably thought how foolish that those people were to believe what they were believing in, having an end the way they had, or even now in today's times, the way, especially more recently, how Christians are made fun of and were thought to be silly to believe in such things. Many of us have family members who probably think us foolish, who don't believe in God and think that we're silly for what we believe in. But when you look at this and see how they are actually the fool, and that we can take comfort in knowing that, we don't need to respond to accusations, or we don't have to feel badly or anything like that, because we know that ultimately God, we have a promise of a future salvation, and in the end they'll see really who the fool is. The way that Christians were back in Rome and now today, in a way, God is just, and all things will be made right in the end. And that this gives me comfort knowing that even though they think that we're the fool, we really know they're the fool. And that they'll come to find that out at one point.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right about why he would go back to that even after having the immediately preceding verse or verses, right, talking about a specific event, is that the victories that we have now are not the permanent one, right? And that just like in the previous psalm and at the very beginning of this psalm, it is looking forward to a future time when all things will be fully accomplished, right? When God's final victory will occur, when he is fully triumphant. Was there, I thought I saw a hand. Okay, and God is going to achieve this final sort of victory, which is why it has, again, such strong applicability coming forward into the New Testament, the broader applicability to not just the Jewish nation, not just to Israel, but to the greater Israel, right? All of us who are considered now descendants of Abraham through our participation in the blood of Christ, through our being part of that greater body. Yeah. And that this, right, this metaphor here at the end, Jacob rejoicing, Israel be glad, the idea that we will all be able to celebrate a final triumph, the final victory of God over the evildoers, is going to be kind of that forward looking to the glorious moment. Yeah. 14, yeah, speaking in general terms. See, I keep running ahead of my notes here. All right, well, that's right. I actually got through all my notes today. And I'm a little ahead of my schedule. So, this is the moment, this only happens about once every 3 months, that if you wish to register a complaint, I actually have time to attend to any complaints. But if there's any other thoughts, questions, usually I'm smart enough to just not leave time for complaints, but I credit this one to having it be almost identical to a psalm we've already talked about and being only 6 verses long that I got through the whole thing. So. Anyone, anything, honestly. Yes, sir.
Is the scattering of bones such a bad thing because of the thought that you can't be resurrected? That coming out of the grave, if your bones are in different countries, it's a little hard to do.
It may have something to do with the nature of resurrection or the idea of the body being raised to new life. I don't think that can really fully explain all of it. The idea that, because they knew this, the Jews knew this, and Jesus makes this very explicit in the gospel, talking about, that God can raise up sons of Abraham from the very stones if he needs to. That you don't, putting a limit on what God is capable of is foolishness. And so I think it ends up being more of almost a cultural thing that is important. Well, I have a real chance to come off on a big rant here about it can be very important to maintain these kinds of ideas about what is good and what is bad in order to show respect. It's less about the thing itself, whether or not it's important or not to keep a body together or not. You could easily think of another culture where it would be incredibly shameful not to have the body be cremated. Right? And in, I think, both cases, the idea or the concept behind that is the important part of it. That we, the living, have an obligation to do what is right even by those who have passed on. And to show proper honor, to show proper respect. It makes me think of, it's a little bit flippant, but Yogi Berra, right, saying that it's very important to go to other people's funerals because if you don't go to theirs, they won't come to yours. And while, okay, that's funny, he has a really good point that there's a reason that we participate in these kinds of rituals with and for one another in order to build and forge those bonds between people in order to show respect and love and affection and to institute that. And I think that that kind of cultural prohibition against scattering the body is just simply one way of preserving and showing respect for people, beings made in the image of God. Okay. I got 2 minutes left on that clock back there. Anyone? All right. Well, if you think of something else, if you get your hand up real fast next week, we can start it before we talk about Psalm 54 next time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.